we welcome you to the official podcast of the Fish Wrapper publication, bringing you story content to inspire, encourage, and uplift the soul. It's our hope you find these stories refreshing, thought-provoking, and motivating as you face the challenges of everyday life. So turn us up and tune your ears, and let's get started by jumping right into the story.
The Setness of Theodosia by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Read by Ruth Risser. When Theodosia Ford married Wesley Brooke after a courtship of 3 years, everybody concerned was satisfied. There was nothing particularly romantic in either the courtship or marriage. Wesley was a steady, well-meaning, rather slow fellow, comfortably off. He was not at all handsome, but Theodosia was a very pretty girl with the milky coloring of an auburn blonde and large china blue eyes, and was known to be sweet-tempered. Wesley's older brother, Irving Brooke, had married a woman who kept him in hot water all the time, so Heatherton folks said. But they thought there was no fear of that with Wesley and Theodosia. They would get along together all right. Only old Jim Parmalee shook his head and said, "They might, and then again, they mightn't." He knew the stock they came from, and it was the kind you could never predict about. Wesley and Theodosia were third cousins. This meant that old Henry Ford had been the great-great-grandfather of them both. Jim Parmalee, who was 90, had been a small boy when this remote ancestor was still alive. There was a little group about the blacksmith's forge on the morning of Theodosia's wedding day. Old Jim was in the center. "And," he went on, "he was about the settest man you'd ever see or want to see. When old Henry Ford made up his mind, a cyclone wouldn't turn him a hairbreadth. No, nor an earthquake neither. Didn't matter a mite how much he'd suffer for it. He'd stick to it if it broke his heart. It's cropped out now and again through all the different branches of the family. I wonder if Dosia hasn't got a spice of it, and Westbrook too, but maybe not." Old Jim was the only croaker. Wesley and Theodosia were married in the golden prime of the Indian summer and settled down on their snug little farm. Dosia was a beautiful bride, and Wesley's pride in her was amusingly apparent. He thought nothing too good for her, the Heatherton people said. It was a sight to make an old heart young to see him march up the aisle of the church on Sunday in all the glossy splendor of his wedding suit, his curly black head held high and his round boyish face shining with happiness, stopping and turning proudly at his pew to show Theodosia in. They always sat together, and Alma Spencer, who sat behind them, declared that they held each other's hands all through the service. This lasted until spring. Then came a sensation and scandal such as decorous Heatherton had not known. One evening in early April, Wesley came home from the store at the corner, where he had lingered to talk over politics and farming methods with his cronies. This evening he was later than usual, and Theodosia had kept his supper warm for him. She met him on the porch and kissed him. He kissed her in return and held her to him for a minute, with her bright head on his shoulder. The frogs were singing down in the South Meadow swamp, and there was a splendor of silvery moonrise over the wooded Heatherton hills. Theodosia always remembered that moment. When they went in, Wesley, full of excitement, began to talk of what he had heard at the store. Ogden Green and Tom Carey were going to sell out and go to Manitoba. There were better chances for a man out there, he said. In Heatherton, he might slave all his life and never make more than a bare living. Out west,
He might make a fortune.
Wesley talked on in this strain for some time, rehashing all the arguments he had heard Green and Carey use. He had always been rather disposed to grumble at his limited chances in Heatherton, and now the great West seemed to stretch before him, full of alluring prospects and visions. Ogden and Tom wanted him to go, too, he said. He half had a notion to. Heatherton was a stick-in-the-mud sort of place anyhow.
What say, Dosia?
He looked across the table at her, his eyes bright and questioning. Theodosia had listened in silence as she poured his tea and passed him some hot, flaky biscuits. There was a little perpendicular wrinkle between her straight eyebrows. "I think Ogden and Tom are fools," she said crisply. "They have good farms here. What do they want to go to West for? Or you, either? Don't get silly notions in your head, Wes." Wesley flushed.
Wouldn't you go with me, Dosia?
He said. "No, I wouldn't," said Theodosia in her calm, sweet voice. Her face was serene, but the little wrinkle had grown deeper. Old Jim Parmalee would have known what it meant. He had seen the same expression on old Henry Ford's face many a time. Wesley laughed good-humoredly, as if at a child. His heart was suddenly set on going west, and he was sure he could bring Theodosia around. When he broached the subject again 2 days later, Theodosia told him plainly that it was no use. She would never consent to leaving Heatherton and all her friends and go out to the prairies. The idea was just rank foolishness, and he would soon see that himself. All this Theodosia said calmly and sweetly, without any trace of temper or irritation. Wesley still believed that he could persuade her, and he tried perseveringly. He was discouraged to discover, however, that Theodosia was not a great-great-granddaughter of old Henry Ford for nothing. Not that Theodosia ever got angry. Neither did she laugh at him. She met his arguments and pleadings serious enough, but she never wavered.
We hope you've been enjoying the story. We will continue in just a moment. We want to remind you that The Fish Wrapper is available by subscription. Each issue of The Fish Wrapper is jam-packed with story content, amazing recipes, games, jokes, and much, much more. Our readers never want to miss an issue. And you can order yours today by visiting thefishwrapperonline.com or by calling 717-400-FISH. That number again is 717-400-FISH. Now let's return and finish the story.
"If you go to Manitoba, Wes, you'll go alone," she said. "I'll never go, so there's no use in any more talking." Wesley was a descendant of old Henry Ford, too. Theodosia's unexpected opposition roused all the latent stubbornness of his nature. He went over to Centerville oftener and kept his blood at fever heat talking to Green and Carey, who wanted him to go with them, and spared no pains at inducement. The matter was gossiped about in Heatherton, of course. People knew that Wesley Brooke had caught the Western fever and wanted to sell out and go to Manitoba, while Theodosia was opposed to it. They thought Dosia would have to give in at the end, but said it was a pity Wes Brooke couldn't be contented to stay where he was well off. Theodosia's family naturally sided with her and tried to dissuade Wesley. But he was mastered by that resentful irritation roused in a man by opposition where he thinks he should be master, which will drive him into any cause. One day he told Theodosia that he was going. She was making butter in her little snowy clean dairy under the great willows by the well. Wesley was standing in the doorway, his stout, broad-shouldered figure filling up the sunlit space. He was frowning and sullen.
I'm going west in 2 weeks' time with the boys, Dosia.
He said stubbornly.
You can come with me or stay here, just exactly as you please, but I'm going.
Theodosia was looking very neat and pretty in her big white apron as she kept on rolling her balls of golden butter on the print in silence. Her silence irritated her husband. He shuffled impatiently.
Well, what have you to say, Dosia?
Nothing, said Theodosia. If you have made up your mind to go, go you will, I suppose. But I will not. There is no use in talking. We've been over the ground often enough, Wes. The matter is settled. Up to that moment, Wesley had always believed that his wife would yield at last when she saw that he was determined. Now he realized she never would. Under that exterior of milky, dimpled flesh and calm blue eyes was all the iron will of old Henry Ford. This mildest and meekest of women was not to be moved a bit by all argument or entreaty, or insistence on a husband's rights. A great sudden anger came over the man.
You listen to me,
he said thickly.
If you won't go with me, I'll never come back here. Never.
He turned on his heel and strode away. Theodosia kept on with her work. The little perpendicular wrinkle had come between her brows again. Several weeks passed. Wesley was silent and sullen, never speaking to his wife when he could avoid it. Theodosia was as sweet and serene as ever. She made an extra supply of shirts and socks for him, put up his lunch basket, and packed his trunk carefully. But she never spoke of his journey. He did not sell his farm. Irving Brooke rented it. Theodosia was to live in the house. The business arrangements were simple and soon concluded. Heatherton folks gossiped a great deal. They all condemned Theodosia. Even her own people sided against her now. They hated to be mixed up in a local scandal, and since Wes was bound to go, they told Theodosia that it was her duty to go with him, no matter how much she disliked it. It would be disgraceful not to. They might as well have talked to the four winds. Theodosia was immovable. They coaxed and argued and blamed. It all came to the same thing. Even those of them who could be set enough themselves on occasion could not understand Theodosia, who had always been so docile. They finally gave up, as Wesley had done, baffled. Time would bring her to her senses, they said. You just have to leave that still, stubborn kind alone. On the morning of Wesley's departure, Theodosia arose at sunrise and prepared a tempting breakfast. Irving Brooke's oldest son, Stanley, who was to drive Wesley to the station, came over early with his wagon. Wesley's trunk, corded and labeled, stood on the back platform. The breakfast was a very silent meal. When it was over, Wesley put on his hat and overcoat and went to the door, around which Theodosia's morning glory vines were beginning to twine. The sun was not yet above the trees, and the long shadows lay on the dewy grass. The wet leaves were flickering on the old maples that grew along the fence between the yard and the clover field beyond. The skies were all pearly blue, swept clean of clouds. From the little farmhouse, the green meadows sloped down to the valley, where a blue haze wound in and out like a glistening ribbon. Theodosia went out and stood looking on, while Wesley and Irving hoisted the trunk into the wagon and tied it. Then Wesley came up on the porch steps and looked at her.
Dosia,
He said a little huskily.
I said I wouldn't ask you to go again, but I will. Will you come with me yet?
No, said Theodosia gently. He held out his hand. He did not offer to kiss her.
Goodbye, Dosia.
Goodbye, Wes. To be continued.
We hope that you enjoyed this story. and will join us again soon when we unravel another adventure from the pages of the Fish Wrapper. We encourage you to like and subscribe to this podcast, ensuring that you never miss a new episode. See you again soon, and may our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ guide you.